A mirror, a throne, and a final choice. What if the most vain man in Rome was also its most noble? Most emperors conquer, most kill, most die trying to hold the throne, but not Otho. He looked in the mirror one last time, saw what power was turning him into, and broke the cycle. He became the emperor who gave it all up, not for gold, not for peace, but because he didn't want to become the monster Rome expected. This is the story of how a man known for vanity made the most selfless decision in Roman history. Imagine this, an emperor so obsessed with his looks, he wouldn't go to war without his mirror. Now imagine he's the one who ends a civil war. Not with bloodshed, but with a sacrifice no one saw coming. That emperor was Otho, the joke of Rome, the peacock prince, and in the end, the one man who actually saved it from itself. Otho was not a man of war, nor a man of peace. He was a man of mirrors, perfumes, and illusions, who stared longer into his reflection than into the face of Rome itself. And when fate placed the imperial crown upon his carefully groomed head in the chaotic year of 69 CE, he didn't reach for a sword but for his comb, as if styling his hair could smooth the cracks already ripping through the empire. And while others dreamed of power for glory or greed, Otho's dreams were soaked in oils and tinted by the shimmer of polished silver. For he saw the world only through how it made him look, and Rome, bleeding, fractured, roaring for stability, had just handed itself over to a man whose greatest ambition was to be beautiful. And so it began, this strange, shimmering chapter in imperial history, with the death of Galba, an old, shriveled man whose reign had lasted only a heartbeat, and whose fatal mistake had been underestimating the man with the soft hands and sharper eyes. For while Otho wore silk and whispered like a lover, his betrayal struck like a dagger, fast and without pity. And it was in the cold dawn of that January morning that Galba was hacked apart in the Forum, his blood soaking into the cobblestones, as Otho stood nearby, his face unreadable, perfectly powdered, his mind already dressing for the throne. And Rome, stunned by yet another assassination, didn't know whether to cheer or mourn, because no one truly knew who Otho was. Not the boy who had once charmed Nero himself, not the husband who had lost his wife to the emperor, not the exile who had bided his time in Spain, and certainly not the emperor who now smiled faintly as he stepped over Galba's remains, his golden cloak catching the sunlight like a halo woven by devils. And from that moment forward, Otho ruled, not with wisdom or cruelty, not with strength or mercy, but with appearance, as if emperorship was a stage play and Rome the captive audience, and his days were filled with beauty rituals, makeup routines, and endless attention to his black-dyed hair, which he styled with the obsession of a priest tending to relics. And at night he dined with actors and dancers, ordering grapes peeled and wine served in crystal, all while the legions muttered and the Senate squirmed. And beyond the marble walls of the Palatine Hill, chaos whispered like smoke, because Vitellius, another would-be emperor, had been declared ruler by the Rhine legions, and the empire was about to split itself open in civil war again. But Otho, curled in his silks and staring at his reflection, refused to panic. Instead, he began preparing for war the only way he knew how, by ensuring he looked perfect for it. And when he finally did march, his army looked not like warriors but like painted statues, each man adorned in fine garments and polished armor. And Otho himself, absurd yet unshaken, carried a hand mirror into battle, checking his curls even as scouts brought news of enemy movements. And it was this grotesque theater of vanity that defined the early weeks of his rule. As if style could defeat swords, and Rome, ever eager for gossip and scandal, devoured the stories of how their emperor spent hours preparing his outfit for council meetings, of how he demanded only the most fragrant oils be used in camp, of how he wept not for fallen comrades but for a broken fingernail. And through it all, Otho remained calm, as if the universe existed solely to reflect him back to himself. And while he issued decrees, many were surprised to find some sense behind the glamour. He reinstated certain exiles, tried to balance the treasury, and even showed moments of surprising mercy, as though behind the painted mask, a man still lingered, but those moments were fleeting, drowned beneath layers of narcissism. And as the armies of Vitellius closed in from the north, Rome held its breath, unsure whether it would survive another emperor's ego. And Otho, standing before maps with a jeweled dagger in hand, made speeches more concerned with poetic flair than military strategy. For in his mind, every move was a performance, every command a line delivered from center stage. And while his generals pleaded for decisive action, Otho wrote letters to distant governors, filled with flowery language and vague reassurances, and the people, hungry and afraid, began to whisper that perhaps Rome had crowned a mirror instead of a man. And still, he remained composed, smiling at his own reflection as the world burned quietly around him, his robes unstained and his hands too soft for a sword. Yet destiny was not done with him, and the storm of war had only begun to rumble. And soon the emperor of the mirror would find that beauty could not shield him from steel. When the war drums began to thunder louder, echoing across the valleys of northern Italy, Otho did not tighten his grip on a sword. He ordered new armor that shimmered like polished bronze, and made sure his tunic was stitched from silk, dyed in the rarest purple. Because if he was to lead men into battle, he would do it beautifully, as if war were a parade and death an accessory. And while his soldiers sharpened blades and prayed to Mars, Otho stood before his mirror, rehearsing the perfect expression of noble sorrow and heroism, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, that the very men who followed him spoke of their emperor not as a warrior, but as an actor drenched in perfume, a creature of vanity more than valor. And still he marched, with his legions reluctantly behind him, toward the inevitable clash with Vitellius, a man of brutish appetites and crude commands, whose army was not polished but battle-hardened, stained with blood and dust. And as Otho's forces moved north, the people of Rome remained behind in anxious silence, watching their emperor vanish beyond the city gates like a prince into a doomed tale. And when he arrived at the front, the reality of war began to peel away his fantasy. Wounded men cried in the mud, the stink of death clung to the air, and no amount of incense could mask the stench of rotting flesh and fear. Yet Otho refused to retreat into dread, instead hosting feasts in the field, demanding grapes flown in from the south, and music played by trembling slaves, as if denying reality could bend it to his will. But even among this madness there were moments, brief flickers, where Otho showed something rare, something almost noble. For when news came of soldiers needing rest or supplies, he acted swiftly, not with cruelty but with strange kindness, paying out of his own purse, refusing to allow plundering of local villages, insisting that his war not ruin the innocent. And though his generals mocked his soft nature, the common soldiers began to murmur that perhaps there was more to their emperor than powder and rings. Perhaps beneath the glamour stood a man trying desperately to matter. And yet time was not his ally, because Vitellius's forces advanced like a dark wave, brutal and unrelenting, and every report brought worse news. Outposts falling, scouts slain, roads cut off, and while Otho's commanders begged him to wait, to regroup, to buy time, he refused, declaring that delay was dishonor and that courage demanded sacrifice, though some suspected it was not bravery but vanity that drove him. The desire to be remembered not as a joke, but as a tragic hero, as someone who had dared to fight and fall for Rome. And so he gave the order to march to Bedriacum, toward the waiting swords of Vitellius, even as omens blackened the skies and his advisors wept in private. And on the eve of battle, Otho walked through the camp dressed in gold-threaded robes, whispering blessings, touching foreheads, giving out coins, looking less like a general and more like a saint preparing for martyrdom. And the men, bewildered by this soft-spoken emperor with his manicured fingers and melancholic eyes, found themselves moved not by fear, but by the strange, aching conviction that their leader believed, truly believed, in something greater than himself. And when dawn broke and the battle began, Otho stayed behind, not out of cowardice, but because he had already decided what he would do if they lost. And as screams tore through the fields and swords met shields with thunderous crashes, Otho waited, listening, breathing slowly, his mirror resting beside him, untouched for the first time in weeks. And when the word finally came, defeat, disaster, slaughter, he did not rage or sob. He simply nodded, as if confirming a prophecy whispered long ago. And then he sat down to write, not orders, not pleas, but letters, dozens of them, filled with soft, apologetic words to friends, family, and even enemies, telling them that Rome must not suffer more bloodshed for his sake, that honor meant knowing when to vanish. And as his scribes wept, he embraced each one gently. And when the night fell, he bathed in silence, put on a fresh robe, lit a candle, and took up the dagger not to kill an enemy, but himself, though not just yet. For that moment still waits, a few chapters away, and instead he stared into the flame, seeing his reflection in its golden flicker. wondering perhaps if history would remember him as he wished. Not as the painted emperor, not as Nero's shadow, but as the man who walked into war, dressed like a god and chose death over disgrace, a man whose final act would be his most haunting. In the weeks leading up to the fatal clash that would shape the destiny of Rome, Otho, instead of hardening into a typical general, only doubled down on his theatrical existence, turning each military camp into a bizarre extension of his palace, where soldiers marched to the beat of flutes and banners were embroidered with his initials in golden thread. And though some of his officers gritted their teeth at the extravagance, Otho insisted that war was not only a matter of strategy but of morale, of appearance, of illusion, believing deeply that if his men saw beauty, grace, and confidence in their emperor, they would absorb those qualities as armor against fear. So he hosted elaborate dinners before every advance. With fine wine and olive oil from the best estates, dancers brought in under moonlight, and he often stood before his army not to give orders, but to deliver speeches as if performing in a grand theater, lifting his chin and letting his carefully oiled curls glisten in the torchlight as he told them that they were fighting not for him, but for dignity, for Rome's honor, for a world where barbarians like Vitellius did not rule. And the strangest part of all was that many believed him, or at least wanted to, because even if he was strange, even if he was painted and perfumed, he was theirs, and he did not demand blind obedience, but instead offered something close to affection, calling his soldiers by name, asking about their families, walking through the tents at night like a ghost in white silk, murmuring blessings over the wounded. And for many of the hardened men of Rome, it was the first time an emperor had looked at them like human beings instead of numbers. And though the enemy grew nearer, Otho continued to prepare not just for battle, but for legacy, sending scribes ahead to temples, ordering statues of himself to be carved, not in traditional Stoic poses, but in dramatic forms, arms outstretched, eyes toward heaven, robes fluttering as if caught in divine wind. Because he was no longer trying to govern, he was trying to become myth. And still, every day, reports came of Vitellius's troops swallowing more land, of towns turning their gates against Otho, of spies whispering betrayal. Yet the emperor did not flinch, instead practicing how he would fall if struck, how he would cry out not in pain, but in poetry, because in his mind, death was not something to fear. It was the final scene, the climactic act, and it had to be beautiful, unforgettable, eternal. And though his advisors grew pale and begged him to retreat south, to regroup, to call upon allies, Otho shook his head and said that cowards flee, but artists finish the play, and he truly saw himself as an artist, of image, of presence, of fate. And when his soldiers were too tired to train, he had musicians play instead, saying that a man who marches to music marches with purpose, even if that purpose is doom. And as the days passed and the fields turned red with enemy banners, Otho rode through his ranks wearing ivory-plated armor, not built for war but for spectacle. And he smiled, waving gently, promising victory with the voice of a man already preparing his own eulogy. And yet there was a haunting beauty in his resolve, because while Rome's other emperors killed for power, Otho seemed ready to die for meaning, for performance, for something beyond himself. And he wrote letters to the Senate saying he would not let civil war tear the empire apart, not for a throne, not for ego, not even for vengeance. And in these letters, he was no longer vain or painted. He was honest, sorrowful, poetic, a man who saw the collapse of peace as a wound he had to heal, even if the healing required his own blood. And when scouts finally reported that Vitellius's armies outnumbered them nearly 2-1, his generals again urged caution. Yet Otho only smiled and asked if the stars above still shone brightly, for he believed fate was watching, writing, directing, and when he stepped into the temple of Apollo the night before the final campaign, he whispered prayers not for victory, but for grace in defeat, for memory, for forgiveness, and some say he even wept, not because he was afraid, but because he knew that history is rarely kind to men like him, too soft to be feared, too strange to be loved, too tragic to be ignored. And as thunder rolled across the skies and lightning split the hills beyond the horizon, Otho returned to his tent, set out his finest robe, the one lined with pearls and perfumed with frankincense, and placed a fresh dagger beside his bed. Not for the enemy, not yet, but as a silent promise to the gods that he would not let Rome bleed for his ambition. And as sleep finally claimed him, the camp around him stirred in nervous silence. caught between admiration and dread, following a man they could not understand, toward a war they knew they could not win. And yet somehow they marched, because beneath the perfumes and poetry, Otho had become something rarer than a warrior. He had become a symbol, a mirror for every soldier's hope that death, when it came, might be meaningful. As dawn broke over the low hills outside Bedriacum, Otho stood at the edge of his camp, not in iron or chainmail like a proper general, but draped in a dazzling white cloak lined with silver thread, his hair meticulously curled and set with powdered saffron, and his face painted faintly with blush, so subtle that only those closest to him could see it. And yet somehow, it didn't make him ridiculous. Not to his men, not anymore, because they had grown used to this emperor who wore perfume instead of sweat, who treated the battlefield like a grand marble hall, who stared at approaching death not with gritted teeth but with soft defiance, as if death itself should be charmed by him. And though his commanders begged him again that morning to let someone else lead the charge, to remain behind the front, to preserve his life and the legitimacy of his rule, Otho refused, saying that if he were to demand loyalty and sacrifice, then he must offer it in return. And so he mounted his stallion, draped not in a war harness, but in peacock-colored silks, and rode before his legions with the calm of an actor stepping onto a familiar stage. And his soldiers, hard-eyed veterans of Germany and Gaul, did not jeer or laugh. Instead, they roared his name, not because they believed they would win, but because Otho, in all his strangeness, had made them believe that their fight was something grander than politics, something noble, even beautiful. And as the armies of Vitellius came into view, black banners snapping like jaws in the wind, Otho raised his hand, not in a command to charge, but in a soft wave, a farewell gesture, as if acknowledging the curtain was rising on the final act. And what followed was chaos, a clash of blood and steel and fire, where no perfume could mask the stench of dying men, where no silk could shield flesh from spears. And though Otho remained on horseback, he did not retreat, did not flinch, even when enemy cavalry cut down his standard bearers and broke the first lines of his infantry, even when the dust turned red and cries for medics drowned in the clang of shields. He only urged his horse forward, blade drawn, a blade too ornate for real battle, but sharp nonetheless, and his attendants begged him to withdraw, but he simply smiled and said, "Let history write what it must," and plunged into the fray, not as a warrior, but as a figure of legend, his robes trailing behind him like smoke. And though his forces fought with valor, they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers and the cunning of Vitellius's generals, who had no taste for drama and every appetite for victory. And by nightfall, the fields were littered with corpses and broken standards. And Otho, miraculously, was still alive, blood on his cheek, not his own, cloak torn, voice hoarse but unshaken, and his officers pleaded with him again to escape, to retreat south, to rebuild, because he still had loyal troops. He still had a chance. But in Otho's eyes, the play was already over. The applause had faded, and what came next was not ruling, not vengeance, but silence. And so he returned to his tent, dismissed all guards, and wrote letters. Not declarations, not commands, but soft, careful goodbyes to the Senate, to his family, to his soldiers, and in each one he asked for peace, begged that no more blood be spilled for a crown, and that Rome should not fall into the pit of endless civil war just to defend a man who had once curled his lashes before battle. And then he bathed, slowly, methodically, scrubbing the grime of war from his skin with rose-scented water. And he dressed, not in armor, but in a fresh tunic, pale blue embroidered with sea creatures to remind him of his youth in Lusitania, the days before ambition took root, and he lay down, placing the letters in a neat pile, placing the dagger beside them, and staring up at the silk canopy above him, he whispered not a prayer, but a line from a forgotten play. When the stars forget their names, who remembers the actor? And he smiled to himself, a soft, contented smile, because he knew that by dying not as a tyrant, but as a sacrifice, by letting go of the crown before it dragged Rome into ruin, he was doing something greater than ruling. He was choosing legacy over power, grace over stubbornness, poetry over brutality. And in the quiet hour before dawn, Otho pressed the blade to his chest and did not scream, did not flinch, only breathed deeply, one last time, as if inhaling the memory of everything he had tried to be. And when they found him the next morning, he was peaceful, as if asleep, and the only sign of death was the gentle spill of crimson across the blue sea, embroidered tunic. And though Rome would go on to forget his policies, forget his laws, even forget his name, the soldiers who had fought beside him would never forget the strange emperor who wore perfume into battle and chose to die not for conquest, but for calm, and perhaps that more than victory is what Rome needed most. As the news of Otho's death began to spread through the Roman world like a slow-moving storm, there was a strange stillness in the capital, not of peace, but of breath held tight in disbelief, for no one, not even his enemies, had truly expected him to choose death over another bid for power. And now the Senate sat in uneasy silence. The people whispered in alleyways and markets, and the courtiers who had once mocked his vanity now spoke of his end with hesitant awe, as if unsure whether to mourn or marvel. And yet, while the city of Rome processed the loss of a man who had ruled for just 3 months, the more haunting story was happening, not in marble halls, but in the private quarters Otho had once occupied, where the scent of his lotions still lingered in the air, where his mirrors stood untouched, reflecting only the absence of the man who once gazed into them so obsessively, and his slaves, unsure of what to do, still cleaned his cosmetics jars, still folded his silk robes, still lit the lanterns near the ivory-framed looking-glass he had brought with him from Lusitania, as if somehow he might return to admire himself once more. But what those mirrors now reflected was not vanity, but ghostliness, an echo of a man who had been both ridiculous and profound, whose obsession with appearance had not been mere foolishness, but a fragile attempt to hold on to something permanent in a world that devoured emperors like meat. And there were stories whispered among the palace staff, strange stories, that on some nights, when the wind howled down the Tiber and the moonlight caught the mirrors just right, one could glimpse Otho's figure in the reflection, adjusting his hair with gentle fingers, inspecting his profile from different angles, his face serene, not as an emperor, but as a memory, and even stranger were the testimonies of soldiers who had marched with him at Bedriacum, who claimed that in the nights following his death, they dreamt of him standing beside them in battle armor, woven from smoke and starlight, a mirror in one hand, a dagger in the other, whispering not words of vengeance but simple questions. Do I still look like myself? Is this who I wanted to be? And they would wake drenched in sweat, shaken not by terror but by sorrow, for Otho's death had done something no battle ever could. It had unsettled Rome's idea of what power meant. It had shown that even the vainest man could become a symbol of self-sacrifice, and yet the city, being what it was, could not linger too long in reverence. And so the senators quickly turned their attention to Vitellius, the man who now claimed the empire, a brute who dined 12 times a day and wore his own gluttony like a medal. And while Otho had ruled with scented sleeves and whispered commands, Vitellius ruled with belches and fists, surrounding himself with sycophants who laughed at his jokes and applauded his pig-like appetite. And Rome began to rot not from plague or fire, but from the inside, from the decay of dignity. And those who had once rolled their eyes at Otho's powdered cheeks now spoke wistfully of his elegance, his quiet speeches, his odd grace. And in this strange reversal, Otho's memory grew stronger in death than it had ever been in life. Not as a politician or strategist, but as a kind of tragic figure, part fool, part poet, who had played his role with flair and then exited the stage before it collapsed. And yet even as Rome moved on, even as the Senate scribes erased his edicts and replaced his face on coins, there remained one relic that could not be so easily discarded. The mirror he had carried into battle, cracked but unbroken, found near his tent by a soldier who had watched Otho ride into the fray with the poise of a prince and the resolve of a martyr. And that soldier, nameless in every official record, kept the mirror hidden, wrapped in cloth, and buried beneath the floor of his modest villa. Not as a trophy, but as a warning, as a reminder that emperors are not just warriors or rulers. They are men haunted by reflections, torn between image and identity, torn between how they appear and who they are. And as Rome sank deeper into civil war, and as the blood of new claimants stained the streets and the Tiber alike, the story of the emperor who once stared into a mirror before charging into death became not just legend, but a kind of prayer whispered by those who longed for a leader who valued beauty, not as decoration, but as a shield against brutality. And so Otho, once laughed at for curling his hair and painting his cheeks, became the ghost in Rome's mirror, the emperor who asked not to rule forever, but to die before he became unrecognizable, a man who, in the end, knew that appearances fade, but the choice to step away with dignity burns brighter than any crown. Otho was dead, but Rome didn't grieve. Rome devoured him, just as it had devoured Galba before him, and would devour Vitellius after, because the empire did not run on love or legacy, it ran on appetite. And now that Otho's scent had faded from the marble halls and his silks had been packed away, a new beast took his place on the throne, a beast named Vitellius, who ruled not with style, but with spit, sweat, and shame. And while Otho had once arranged flowers by his bedside and checked his smile before giving orders, Vitellius grunted through his feasts, belched over decrees, and filled the palace with the stench of roasted meat and spilled wine, turning the imperial seat into something closer to a slaughterhouse than a court. And yet, somehow, this was what the Senate had chosen, or pretended to choose, and they called it strength, though what they meant was brutality, and they called it masculinity, though what they meant was animal. And in smoky rooms behind closed doors, old senators would whisper of Otho with a strange longing, saying, "At least he didn't drip grease on his scrolls," or, "At least he smelled like roses, not rot." And though they had mocked his mirror and his rouge, now they found themselves yearning for that ridiculous elegance, because in its place stood a pig in a toga, laughing with his mouth open and making orphans with a wave of his greasy hand. And Rome began to feel something it rarely felt: regret. But it was too late for that now, because Otho was ashes in an urn, and Vitellius was licking his fingers at banquets where slaves died for sport and generals were mocked for not drinking enough. And somewhere beneath that drunken ruin, Rome's soul began to crack, not with a bang, but with a quiet hum of hopelessness, because the people no longer knew whether their rulers were men or monsters, or whether it even mattered anymore. And in the chaos of it all, strange stories began to surface. Stories of Otho sightings, of the emperor's pale face appearing in reflections or dreams, his powdered cheeks and somber eyes hovering like a phantom above the chaos, whispering warnings no one wanted to hear. And one soldier claimed he saw him standing over the Tiber at dawn, brushing imaginary dust from his tunic, muttering, "This isn't the empire I died for," before vanishing into mist. And another said a mirror delivered from Bedriacum arrived cracked but cold to the touch, even in sunlight. And when a servant peered into it, she swore she saw not herself, but Otho's hand reaching out, fingers trembling, as if trying to fix a strand of hair that no longer existed. And though many dismissed these tales as wine-fed nonsense, there was something in them, something sticky and real, like the way a song gets stuck in your mind, or a perfume you can't forget. And as Vitellius continued to feast and Rome continued to burn, Otho's name returned to the lips of the people, not as a ruler they adored, but as a symbol they missed without understanding why. Because in a world of blood and ruin, even foolish beauty became sacred, and even vanity looked noble compared to madness. And mothers began to tell their children stories of the emperor who carried a mirror into battle, and courtiers left coins beneath cracked glass in his name, and some whispered that Otho had not really died, that he had staged it all, that he lived in disguise among the bathhouses and perfumers, waiting for Rome to weep for him before returning, radiant and vengeful, like a god of reflection and grace. But the truth, of course, was that he was gone, truly gone, and the only thing he left behind was the echo of his strange dignity in a city that had traded its last shred of shame for gluttony and gore. And so while Rome crowned a butcher and called him emperor, while bodies lined the alleys, and priests offered blessings in temples stained with vomit and wine, a single room in the palace remained locked and undisturbed. Otho's chamber, untouched since his death, filled with quiet, filled with ghosts, where a comb still lay beside a bronze mirror, where a robe hung untouched on its peg, and where the scent of lavender refused to fade, no matter how many times the window was opened or the incense burned, as if the air itself refused to forget him. And even in death, Otho remained what he had always been. Not a great man, not a brilliant general, but something more fragile and more haunting. A reminder that sometimes, in a world ruled by beasts, a man who cares for beauty, who steps into death with style and silence, leaves a mark no sword can erase. As the seasons changed and the filth of Vitellius's Rome grew thicker in the gutters and heavier in the air, the memory of Otho, rather than fading, began to spread like perfume, clinging to every corner of the capital. And while the new emperor roared through banquets, bloated and laughing at his own vulgarity, there were whispers carried on the breeze. whispers that clung to the marble walls and drifted through the Senate like ghosts refusing to rest. And those whispers spoke not of the man Otho had been, but of the hole he had left behind, a strange, glittering absence that gnawed at the soul of the city. Because Rome had long since grown used to cruelty, but never before had it been ruled by such mindless filth. And so even those who once scoffed at Otho's powders and oils now stared longingly at fading frescoes of his brief reign, remembering how his footsteps never echoed too loudly, how his words, though vain, were measured, and how his presence, however absurd, still bore a kind of elegance that now seemed almost divine in its rarity. And in the depths of night, when the city's chaos softened into uneasy sleep, those same senators who betrayed him found themselves haunted not by guilt but by longing, as though they had murdered the last beautiful thing in Rome, and now must live in a world of brutes and beasts, and in dark corners people began to gather, not in rebellion, not in mourning, but in strange little ceremonies meant to honor what they could no longer touch, lighting candles before broken mirrors, placing combs and ribbons beside fountains, speaking his name not as a prayer but as a warning. "Look what happens when beauty dies," they would whisper. And still Vitellius lumbered through the palace like a drunken ox, slaughtering his enemies with laughter, filling his court with singers and jesters who choked on his humor, and painting over Otho's delicate murals with scenes of gore and gluttony, as if trying to erase not just the man, but the memory of refinement itself. But it never worked, because beauty, even in death, has a stubborn afterglow. And Otho's ghost began to outshine the living emperor, not through fear, but through fascination, because he had become something more than man, more than ruler. He had become myth, a glittering phantom of a time when Rome pretended to care about grace, and soon strange things began to happen. Soldiers swore they saw him on the battlefield, not alive but hovering like mist, tilting his head as if judging their uniforms. And once during a feast, a nobleman who mocked Otho's mascara fell choking into his cup, and the servants swore the last thing he saw was his own face, cracked and bleeding in a goblet's reflection. And even the women of the palace, once made to serve Vitellius with shaking hands and hidden bruises, now began to speak of Otho with unexpected reverence, leaving rosewater in their hair not to seduce, but to remember, because even if he was foolish, even if he was vain, he had never laid a hand on them in rage, never laughed as they wept, and in a city where mercy was more myth than memory, that was enough to make him sacred. And in time, the cult of Otho emerged, not with temples or statues, but with glances and gestures, with silences that said more than sermons. And it was in these quiet rebellions that his presence lived on, stronger than any decree or sword. Because while Vitellius ruled the city with gluttony, Otho ruled the shadows with glamour. And there, in those dim spaces between cruelty and chaos, his legend grew teeth, because stories began to shift. He was no longer the emperor who died for pride. He was the emperor who chose death to protect dignity. The man who met ruin with powder on his cheeks and steel in his hand. The man who faced an empire and said, "No," and meant it. And as the people grew more desperate and the streets more violent, the mirror, once his tool of vanity, became a symbol of rebellion. Because in a world where emperors were beasts, a man who dared to look at himself, to see himself, to try and be something other than blood and muscle, became a martyr, not of war, but of soul. And so Rome trembled, not from battle, not from famine, but from memory, the unbearable weight of a man who once tried to make the empire beautiful again, and who was crushed for it. And now, even as statues crumbled and banners burned, that memory remained, soft but sharp, a reflection in every polished blade, a whisper in every scented breeze, and deep in the heart of the palace. Behind locked doors and beneath dusty claws, the last untouched mirror stood waiting, its silver surface dark with age but unbroken. Because even now, even after death, Otho still watched, not to judge, not to rule, but to remind the city of what it had lost and what it had become, and perhaps of what it might still be, if only it dared to look. As Rome continued to rot beneath the weight of Vitellius' greed, with streets now lined with filth and palaces reeking of spoiled meat and spilled wine, the memory of Otho refused to die. If anything, it began to burn brighter, like the final flicker of a candle before everything is swallowed by darkness. Because what started as whispered nostalgia soon curdled into rage and across the empire. From the gardens of senators to the muddy boots of common soldiers, People began to question why the man who brought grace had to die, while the beast who devoured everything around him still sat bloated on the throne. And while Vitellius threw more games, stuffed more food into his throat, and crucified his critics on the Appian Way, the spirit of Otho became something dangerous, not just a memory, but a mirror being held up to Rome itself, showing the empire not what it was, but what it had become. A place where elegance was punished, where thought was mocked, where cruelty was power and ugliness ruled in all forms. And so began the quiet unrest, not with swords or fire, but with symbols and stares, with locks of curled hair worn on helmets, with mirrors carried by messengers, with small shrines hidden behind curtains, where soldiers lit incense and whispered prayers to a man who had once cared about how he looked, not out of vanity, but out of defiance. And in the east, under the skies of a new rebellion, a general named Vespasian watched this unfold and understood something crucial: that the people no longer wanted another brute. They wanted someone who understood the empire was more than land and taxes. It was an idea, and ideas need beauty. And so as he slowly gathered support in armies, Vespasian said nothing publicly about Otho, but his officers began to wear his scent, and one was seen combing his hair in the middle of a campaign, not to mock but to honor, because in war-torn provinces, people no longer saluted the eagle, they saluted the ghost. And in Rome itself, as Vitellius tried to distract the mob with blood and bread, they no longer chanted his name. They began to murmur Otho's, soft at first, like a sigh through marble corridors, then louder, growing each day like a drumbeat behind the emperor's back. And the more he tried to stomp it out, the more it spread, because you cannot kill a reflection, not when it's carved into the soul of a city. And the final sign came not with violence, but with theater, when a group of performers staged a play mocking Otho, his wigs, his mirror, his vanity. But the crowd, instead of laughing, turned silent, and then someone shouted, "He died like a man!" And the applause shook the walls until the actors fled in shame. And Vitellius, red-faced and foaming, ordered arrests. But even his guards hesitated, because many of them had fought beside Otho, and many had seen him die with dignity while this pig cowered behind roast chickens. And it was then the tide began to turn for real. Not with marching boots, but with the silent withdrawal of loyalty. The kind of subtle betrayal that happens when men stop believing. And though Vitellius drank harder and raged louder, deep inside, he could feel it too. That cold sweat that comes when even your enemies are no longer afraid, because you've become a joke. And in his chambers, surrounded by whores and hangers-on, he began to see things, or so the stories claimed, mirrors cracking on their own, shadows flickering in corners, the faint sound of combs scraping through hair in the night. And once he screamed during a feast, claiming Otho had walked past the window wearing his imperial cloak, face powdered, eyes empty. And while most dismissed it as drunken madness, others began to believe the dead emperor was coming back. Not in flesh, but in force, in legacy, in every eye that turned away from Vitellius and toward the east, where change was rising like a storm. And so, as Vespasian's forces grew stronger and Rome's walls grew weaker, the ghost of Otho moved freely through the city, unchallenged, untouchable. Not a man anymore, but an idea. And ideas, once born, cannot be unmade. And in the final weeks before the collapse, as food ran out, as slaves rioted, as nobles packed bags and prepared to flee, there were more mirrors in the city than swords, more incense than orders, and everywhere, on doors, on fountains, on altars, one letter was scrawled in oil and ash. Oh, not for Otho the man, but for Otho the memory, Otho the martyr, Otho the emperor, who died too soon but looked good doing it. The people did not cry out in terror. They smiled because they knew justice was coming, not just for Rome, but for the mirror that had once reflected the empire's last shred of dignity, and now stood cracked but not broken, waiting for the city to remember who it had once been before the blood and the vomit drowned it. And in that final hush before rebellion became revolution, all eyes turned east. Not toward a general, but toward the ghost in the glass, whose powdered cheeks and silent stare had become the symbol of something greater than power, the longing for a Rome that could still recognize its own face. The streets of Rome did not erupt with fire or screams when the end began. They pulsed instead with a quiet certainty, like the final breath before a plunge, Because by now, Vitellius was no longer seen as an emperor, but a disease, something bloated and festering that had to be removed for the city to breathe again. And so when Vespasian's general, Antonius Primus, marched on Rome with legions hardened by real war and led by the ghost of Otho in their hearts, there were no true defenders left. For even Vitellius's praetorians had grown sick of guarding a pig in purple robes. And so gates opened, swords lowered, and the end of a dynasty began not with resistance, but with abandonment. And Vitellius, drunk and half-mad, tried to rally what few mercenaries still clung to his gold. But they were already looting the palace, and when he stood before them in his wine-stained toga, demanding loyalty, they laughed in his face and walked away. And still he clung to power with the greasy hands of a man who could not imagine life without it, wandering the imperial halls screaming for his cooks, his jesters, anyone to remind him who he was. But the throne room was empty now, its marble stained with wine and the scent of fear. And finally, as the sound of marching boots echoed through the streets, Vitellius did what he had always done. He ran, not with dignity but with terror, slipping through servant tunnels dressed in rags, hiding in corners like a rat, while his empire crumbled above him. But Rome was done hiding him, and as word spread of the city's liberation, people poured into the streets not to mourn, but to watch. And when Vitellius was found days later, dragged from a dog-keeper's hut with his beard matted and his voice trembling, the mob did not cheer. They stared, silent and cold, watching as a man who had fed on their suffering now begged like a child. And even then, even with death at his throat, he pleaded not for mercy, but for more time, promising banquets, games, forgiveness. But no one was listening anymore. And as he was hauled through the streets, tied by the neck like an animal, the people of Rome did not throw stones. They threw scraps of rotten food, the same food they'd been forced to eat during the famine his gluttony helped create. And they marched him all the way to the Gemonian stairs, the same stone steps where traitors and monsters were displayed. And there, as the crowd swelled and the sky grew dark, Vitellius was forced to look up and see what he had become. Not a god, not a ruler, but a symbol of everything Rome hated about itself. And when they slit his throat and kicked his body down the steps, there was no triumph in it, only relief. And as his blood soaked into the stones, people whispered a single name, Otho, Otho, Otho. Not in mourning, but in comparison, because Rome had finally remembered what grace looked like. And this filth-covered corpse was the opposite, and so ended the reign of indulgence. Not in fire, but in rot. And as Vespasian was proclaimed emperor days later, his first command was not about war or policy. It was to clean the city, to scrub the filth from the palaces, to remove the stink of the man who had turned Rome into a butcher's stall. And across the empire, statues of Vitellius were pulled down, his image scraped from coins, his name cursed in taverns and temples. But something strange happened too. Small busts of Otho began to appear again, not by command, but by memory, placed on shelves beside household gods, his mirror held up like a relic, his name spoken not in ridicule, but with quiet reverence. And though he had died a self-inflicted death, people no longer saw it as weakness, but as sacrifice, the final act of a man who understood Rome's disease and chose not to become a part of it. And so his ghost lived on, not just in whispered prayers or the silver glint of hand mirrors in the soldiers' belts, but in the very idea that not every emperor had to be a monster, that sometimes beauty could be resistance. And as Rome began to rebuild slowly, painfully, its people never forgot the lesson that cruelty feeds itself, but dignity echoes. And while the name of Vitellius vanished into the sewers of history, the image of Otho, powdered, proud, and unbroken, remained, a reflection they could still recognize, even in the ruins. In the long memory of Rome, most emperors are remembered for the blood they spilled, the wars they waged, or the terror they carved into the hearts of their people. But Otho, strange, vain, tragic Otho, is remembered not for what he conquered, but for what he gave up. And as the empire slowly crawled back from the chaos of the year of the 4 emperors, his name was spoken with increasing wonder, not because he was perfect, but because he did something almost no one else had the courage to do. He chose to lose so others could live. And in the decades that followed, Rome changed rulers again and again, some cruel, some wise. But in every candlelit whisper, every soldier's tale by the fire, the story of Otho returned like a ghost wrapped in velvet. The emperor who carried a mirror into war, not just to see his reflection, but to remind himself of who he was, even when the world wanted him to forget. And that mirror became legend, passed down not as a literal object, but as a symbol, appearing in plays and stories and whispered oaths, representing the idea that power is nothing if it costs you your soul. And so it was that Otho, the man who powdered his face and curled his hair in a time of chaos, who slept in silk while others bled for the throne, came to be remembered as something rare. A man who saw the monster forming in his own reflection and chose to shatter the image before it became real. And though his enemies mocked his vanity, history slowly rewrote him as a mirror held up to Rome itself, forcing the city to look at its own ugliness and ask again and again, what kind of empire are we building? And who are we becoming when we crown beasts as kings? And long after the streets were cleaned of Vitellius's blood and the temples rebuilt, the common people, those who had no statues raised in their honor, still spoke of Otho not with scorn, but with sorrow, as if he were a beautiful painting torn apart by war, too delicate for the ugliness of power. And in that way, his legacy survived not in marble or gold, but in the quiet places, in the mirror on a soldier's belt, in the whispered prayers of mothers who feared their sons would grow up to serve monsters, in the hearts of those who believed that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is walk away. And maybe that's why centuries later, historians and poets still struggle to place him. Was he a fool, a narcissist, a coward, or was he something even rarer in Rome's blood-soaked legacy? A man of conscience who understood the price of his own ambition, and in choosing death, saved what little beauty was left in himself, and maybe, just maybe, in the world around him. And now, dear listener, as the dust of history settles around us, and the stories of emperors rise and fall like tides, ask yourself this: not who wore the crown, or who bathed in gold, but who stood at the edge of ruin, saw the abyss, and turned back, not in fear, but in mercy. For Rome didn't need another tyrant, it needed a mirror, and Otho was brave enough to hold it up, even as it shattered in his hands. If this haunting tale of Otho made you rethink what true courage looks like, don't keep it to yourself. Share this story with someone who believes power always means victory. Hit that like button, subscribe for more forgotten corners of history, and drop a comment. Was Otho a coward or the last noble man in Rome? Let's talk about it below.